So there's three basic assumptions about anarchism that we can inspect and look at if we want to understand why anarchy might be a positive thing. If we want to put forward a positive case for anarchy. Anarchy, true, is the absence of an orderer, and on this, or the absence of a sovereign, if you prefer to put it that way. And on this, that certainly the anarchists and the IR theorists are in agreement. But I think this is where the agreement ends. For IR theorists, anarchy is a risk for us, right? It's a liability. For anarchists, it's not. It's a benefit. In fact, it's great. So it's the very absence of governments and leaders, the absence of an orderer, the absence of a sovereign, that for anarchists makes anarchy so wonderful, right? Because they are advocates of absolute freedom. They believe and they think it's possible for human beings to live in absolute freedom, in which individuals can govern themselves consensually, ethically, and rationally. So it might be helpful here to cast our minds back again to the boys on the island in Lord of the Flies, right? I'll get back to the diagram behind this image in just a minute, but just to put your mind on the boys in Lord of the Flies for a second, if you go back and remember our conversation about the movie, we said that there's a way of looking at that movie that says at first things were working, right? That it was fine for the boys, they were getting along. And the only thing that stopped it working was the fact that, well, you know, not so much the human nature, right? But we're forgetting that these were children, right? These were children who didn't know any better, and we are adults. Is it not plausible to think that we might not fall afoul of irrational fears of beasties and things like that? Arguably it is, right? So, for David Graeber, who's an anthropologist, there are in fact many examples of primitive peoples living rational, mature, adult lifestyles in far-flung communities, even in the present day. You know, Graeber's an expert, for example, on the country of Madagascar, for example, and he has studied primitive communities living in Madagascar today that he believes are lowercase a anarchists, right? That they are what we'll talk about in just a moment as baseline communists. Let me come back to that term in a minute, what I mean by baseline communist. I'll develop it for you, so just keep a note of it for now. So to say, to say then that anarchists believe that anarchy is possible, we have to understand the three reasons why they believe that anarchy is something to celebrate, not something to be solved, which is what realists, liberals, and constructivists all want to do. They all want to take care of the problem of anarchy one way or another, right? So for the anarchists, firstly, liberty, right? The anarchist assumption about liberty is actually the core assumption of all libertarianism, including even conservative libertarianism, which many people espouse to, right? We talked about the Tea Party just a moment ago, which is a libertarian movement by and large. Libertarianism wants to maximize freedom as much as possible. But mainstream or conservative libertarianism differs from anarchism because it wants to keep the state, right? So anarchism is a kind of libertarianism insofar as it shares this aspiration of expanding the realm of individual liberty as much as possible, but anarchism goes a step further than libertarianism because anarchism wants to actually do away with the state altogether, right? Blow it up, get rid of it today, get rid of it last week, okay? It's gone. Human beings are capable of living together as mature, rational adults now, today. Why, though? Why? Because human beings, as adults, have a human capacity for self-organization. They're very good at this. Human beings are basically decent, the anarchists argue. And think in your head here of other self-organizing animals that you see doing amazing work despite the fact that they don't have a leader, despite the fact that they don't have a hierarchy. Think of, if you've ever driven from Chillicothe to Cincinnati in the fall, you'll often see flocks of swallows or starlings on the wing. And it's amazing the shapes that they make and how coherent. There's hundreds of these birds flying in dense clouds. And it's amazing how they manage to anticipate each other's movements and how they manage to move almost like they're a unified being. You know, if you go back, we just had the image of Hobbes's Leviathan there on the screen last slide, and in that image of the Leviathan, he had this idea as well of how you get what we called way back in our realism lecture common power. Well, swallows have common power, but they don't have a leader, right? Similarly, a swarm of bees, well, maybe a swarm of bees has a queen, but even still, I think once they're on the wing, it's clear that they are coordinating themselves in this remarkable way. Geese migrating for the winter take turns in the lead position. It's not clear that they have a leader, right? The strongest flies as long as the strongest can, till it can't, and then someone else takes over. And it's all very, very cooperative. So in this sense, the argument would be that we don't need leaders. We don't need to be told what to do. We can take turns and act on the basis of what we think we need to be doing at that moment in time. The edict is the strong do what they can, or rather, no, that's the wrong edict. From each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. That's the one I was looking for. From each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. That's how the geese do it when they're flying in their V formation. That's how we can cooperate and organize ourselves today. And then the third thing that we need to know about anarchism is that the minute you introduce hierarchy, the minute that there's a power hierarchy in the way we organize ourselves, then you have a problem, because power is corrupting, and absolute power is absolutely corrupting. The state is an actual form of absolute power, and so it is inherently corrupt. So while traditional libertarians, then, just to reiterate this, like those of the Tea Party, do want to maximize their freedom, they appeal their protest to the state, and they ask its democratic representatives for things like increased security, freer markets, because that's how they believe you're going to maximize the space of freedom. Anarchists are different. They take direct action. They take direct action against the state because they believe the state is itself an ultimate corruption and it must be abolished. Because, well, otherwise, how do you keep enforcing these inequitable debt relations that we find ourselves in? I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a little while here in the lecture, so hang on for a little slide or two, and I'll get back to that point. Now, on the other hand, because anarchists believe that all human beings are capable today, right here and now, of being anarchists, it's imperative that the strategies and the tactics that we use to organize our protest, to organize our movement, be as inclusive and horizontal as possible. Why is that important? Because it's important that you practice what you preach. And this is what anarchists refer to as prefigurative politics. I'm going to detail that on the very, very next slide, prefigurative politics. But it's critical that we get one point here clear right now. Graeber is calling for a politics of what he calls new anarchism. And I don't want you to make too much of this, but it's basically just this idea that it's all well and good for us to, turn out at Occupy Wall Street as lowercase a anarchists. But we do need to be kind of programmatic and systematic about becoming proper anarchists. And we have to further apply, then, to become new anarchists, we have to further apply our instinctive, intuitive anarchism, which anarchists believe that we all have anyway. Now, you might not think you yourself are remotely anarchist, but an anarchist would disagree with you. An anarchist would say, well, hang on a minute, are you sure you're not an anarchist? If you see two children squabbling over a toy, what will you tell them? Will you tell them to beat the pulp out of each other until the victor gets the toy? Will you tell them to buy the toy, the rich one to buy the toy from the poor one? No, you won't. You'll say to them, kids, share your toys. Everyone gets a turn. And in that sense, Graeber is arguing there is a kind of an interesting thing in the way we human beings act in our everyday life. We think we're capitalists, we think we're this, that, the other, but we are, all of us, already quite anarchistic in the way we exist in our world, in our ordinary everyday lives. In other words, left to our own devices, uncoerced by the state, uncoerced by the economy and the pressure of living in a free market society, we think it's rational for people not to squabble over their property. We think it's rational for people to take turns and to share, right? That's not to say that you wouldn't have personal, clothes on you. You don't have to share the clothes on your back. No anarchist argues for that, by the way. That's always a canard. And no anarchist is ever going to abolish your Kenny Loggins records if that's the music you're into. No one's going to tell you what music you should like or art you should appreciate. It's just simply a recognition that there are things in our society that are better off shared, and if we didn't have an economy that forced us to treat it as personal property, we wouldn't, right? Because it's just simply not logical. So anarchism then, all anarchism, lowercase a and capital A anarchism, is this taking of the ideas of common decency to each other, right? Treating each other with respect, treating each other with sort of minimal ethical decency, and taking it to its logical conclusion. We are already anarchists in our everyday lives. Why not extend it out to the world that we live in a full political sense? So for Graeber then, and this, by the way, is the famous bull on Wall Street. I just wanted to put that in there because I think it's a really cool image. For Graeber then, how do we take these ideas to their conclusion? There are three basic points he raises about how we take this ordinary everyday anarchism and apply it to something really tangible. The first point is horizontal direct democracies, right? Sometimes tiny, sometimes large groups of people will self-organize, just like those flocks of swallows I was describing between Chillicothe and Cincinnati, who can exist in a leaderless organization, right? Human beings self-organizing, self-governing in a way that's consensual and in a way that's collective. The neighbors can sometimes get together in our communities to organize a cleanup of the local area, right? Obviously we get our trash taken to the rubbish dump every week or so. But we might, with the neighbors in our community, organize a day that we come together to clean up, cigarette butts that people might have thrown in the sidewalk or something, right? Coca-Cola cans that people might have thrown out their car windows onto the road that our community lives on. That's an example of people organizing themselves without having to be told what to do, right? So, there's lots of little examples like that show us that human beings every day organize themselves in ways that are horizontal and not vertical. Occupy Wall Street formalized that everyday anarchism in the context of the General Assemblies that they had, and I've got some video footage for you guys of that if you look at the links that are in the Blackboard for this week. So General Assemblies, as you'll see in the Amy Goodman interview, for example, involve people, facilitating each other to have a conversation where everyone gets to participate and everyone gets to vote. And the General Assemblies of Occupy Wall Street, had literally thousands of people in them deciding how to live together and how to make the camp that they had for months and months, how to keep it clean, how to keep it safe for women, how to make sure that people with disabilities were taken care of, that kind of thing. So direct democracies are self-organizing communities where decisions are made collectively and consensually. Now, the next thing that we need to think about as we try to get from everyday, ordinary anarchism to formal new anarchism in a kind of a global programmatic sense is utopian preconfigurations. Now, as the name suggests, this is about the better future that is to come, right? We are prefiguring the world that we want to live in. Mahatma Gandhi, famous Indian revolutionary Gandhi, I'm sure you've heard of him, always argued that you have to be the change that you want to see in the world. To be the change that you want to see in the world. That if you are willing to embody the values of the world that you want to live in the here and now, you can create elements of that utopian future here, right? Because other people will join you. And so the point there being that, to look at how Occupy Wall Street functioned, and to look at not just the fact that they camped out, but that they camped out and modeled for us a version of direct democracy for months and months as they sustained their camp. It was a form of advertising, if you will, right? It was a form of advertising that said to the media and the video cameras and the newspaper reporters that were down there talking to them, this is working, right? This is actually something that's possible for human beings to do. We're down here for months. We're organizing ourselves in a horizontal fashion, and we're getting along just fine. We've got cleaning rotations, cooking rotations, trash rotations, sewage disposal rotations, you name it, right? So this is how we're going to show you that it is possible to function without the state, without the United States operating over us and forcing the principles of representative democracy on us, right? And then finally, thirdly, a way that new anarchism can be made or brought into existence is simply, as we were describing on the last slide, ethical common decency. It can be as trivial as not jumping ahead of someone in a queue, or letting someone less able than you to be able to sit down on a bus that's closer to the front door, and letting an old lady sit down in the seat, letting someone have your seat who looks like they need it. That is ordinary, everyday human decency. But taking this ethical common decency again to its logical conclusion, it has political implications because it requires us fundamentally to rethink how we ought to behave towards each other in a political sense. And of course, in 2008, that political question was the question of debt, and whether we should be enforcing people to pay back their debts and moralizing about those debts in the way that we were. So let's talk about that now. What is debt? Why were anarchists specifically concerned and focused on debt in 2008? Well, first of all, it's important to rethink the meaning of debt. It's the topic of Graeber's 2011 book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. It's a book that's important not only because it says what debt and indebtedness means and how debt prefigures the 99%, as those who are questioning what indebtedness means and how indebtedness ought to be lived. So we can think about it, for example, using the example of a car, right? Say you borrow $1,000. This is the example that Cynthia Weber used in the book, which I like, right? So it's you borrow $1,000 from a bank to buy a used car, adding up the loan and the interest on the loan over the term of the loan, you can calculate exactly what your debt is to the bank, right? It's a very simple, very straightforward thing to calculate. And it's very beneficial for both the borrowers and the lenders, right? So it's a good deal, right? You don't have the money, you need the money. You will be able to pay it back if you can have a car, because a car will allow you to get a job. And a job allows you to pay back the car, and then hopefully you own the car, and then you can start making money once you've paid it back. So this is kind of not how David Graeber wants us to think about debt, right? Because he's saying that there's actually much, much, much more going on in the question of debt than simply this straightforward transactional view or technical view that we think about when we want to borrow a car. So debt is a problem for Graeber because it is so impersonal, right? It's in our system today, in our world, we denominate debt in financial terms. We denominate it as money. So the loan officer at the bank that you go to borrow the money from for the car is only interested in your ability to pay off the loan in terms of that money. They're not interested in knowing why you needed the loan. They're not interested in knowing the human story behind the loan. So for instance, if you need the car to get to classes and to your job, and then to travel on the weekends to see your parents and care for them because they're feeling sick, right? Because maybe the state that you're in or the city that you're in doesn't have weekend support for your poor parents on weekends, right? So, the loan officer doesn't care. The loan officer only cares about the numbers, right? The ones and the zeros in the actual computer program that dictates what the actual debt that you actually owe is, right? So loan officers don't care about that information. They don't need to know that information because they're not calculating or thinking about the human effects, or what some economists might call the externalities of the debt. They are just calculating in simple quantitative terms. What you owe them, it's a number. It's what you owe them and what the bank will get in collateral if you don't pay off your debt. So and collateral, by the way, by collateral I mean the car itself or the house that you bought, right? So the bank would inherit that from you if you can't pay it off, right? It would be repossessed. Now, debt calculated then and quantified in terms of money, we see is clearly impersonal. It's not interested in the human story. It's not interested in the background. So now that we know how the bank sees debt, let's ask, how do we see the debt of the car loan, right? How do we experience that debt despite its impersonal nature? If we go back to the example of the car, and let's suppose you start missing your loan payments for reasons that are out of your control. Gas prices go up, your tuition prices hike up, your job hours get cut back, or maybe you have to cut back your hours because your parents get sick and now you have to care for them during the week. Well, whatever happens, you're faced with a problem. You can't pay off your debt. And because of this, others aren't going to see you in kind terms, right? Because people who can't pay their debts aren't just judged financially, they're judged morally, right? Most of us will not think that it is immoral for the bank to come along and repossess your car, for example, if you can't pay off the debts. Most of us will think that it is immoral for you not to pay back your debt. So what this means is that your inability to pay back the debt is kind of immaterial, right? When the money is loaned to you, it's loaned to you as money, right? And a deal is a deal, as David Graeber is quoted by Cynthia Weber as saying, right? So from the bank's perspective, a deal is a deal. But there's a problem here, right? The deal is the deal doesn't really look at what the deal meant to you in your human experience. And so for you, sure, a deal is a deal, but it doesn't mean the same thing, right? And not everyone approaches the question of debt the same way, therefore. So history shows us that, and I'm quoting here from Graeber, debts between equals are not the same as debts between people who are not equals, right? And the reality is, if you've borrowed $5 from your friend isn't going to send around the sheriff's department with baseball bats or battering rams to get that $5 back from you. But the bank can ask the sheriff to do that. The bank can go and get a court order for you to be foreclosed upon. And you lose your home, you lose your car, right? So you can see this clearly in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Debts between equals are not the same as debts between people who are not equals. And the Wall Street banks are not our equals, right? Be very, very clear on this, right? When they went to the wall, they were bailed out, not for reasons of morality, but for technical reasons, right? When we have trouble with our debts, we don't get that technical rationale applied to us. We get morality applied to us, and the police come calling, and we are foreclosed on and potentially even locked up and judged as criminals. So this is very, very important. David Graeber, again, to quote from him, debts between social classes, between the rich and the poor, suddenly become a matter of absolute morality. It's a very old pattern, he says, And this is the problem for Graeber. In fact, it's the problem for Graeber. Despite the evidence that those in power very quickly drop the morality language when it suits them, most people today still believe that paying your debt isn't just a financial or technical obligation, but in fact it's a moral one, right? Why would I say that? Because, well, debts are calculated in terms of money, and money has the capacity to, because it's so abstract, because it's a cold sum of money, it doesn't have any kind of like emotional content to it. It's just judgment, right? So it turns morality into a matter of impersonal arithmetic. And by doing so, it justifies what would otherwise maybe seem to be outrageous or obscene. So money is the issue here. If you can express a debt in terms of money, and it's owed to someone who's in a position of social hierarchy to you, like a bank, or a financial institution that has the courts and the police on their side, then considerations of morality become quite relativistic. Really, what we see is that the morality that you and I are judging our own debts because we feel terribly guilty that we can't pay is in fact immaterial to the bank. What's determining the outcome at the end of the day is the power. Power is the factor, the variable that explains who owes what at the end of the day. Now, contrast that with debts between equals. Remember, that was the part of our quote just a moment ago. Debts between friends, debts between equals aren't really worked out as pure calculations for two good reasons. One, friends are those with whom we share the information that the banks are not interested in, which is like, as we said earlier on, the human cost, the squishy part of the story, right? You know, because as your friend, if I've lent you money, I'm very aware of the pressure you're under, trying to look after your parents, trying to keep your job down, trying to finish your school, right? As your friend, I'm aware of that. I don't just look at the debt that's between us, that you owe me, in terms of the numeric value, the coldly, dispassionately expressed numerical value. So we share these bits of information then that don't fit into calculations of debt with our friends because friendships are incalculable. So that's two really important factors then that we have to consider that differentiate the difference between debts between non-equal partners and debts between equal partners or friends. Between friends, we have human information about the human story, and we also have an awareness that friendship is, true friendship at least, is incalculable. If we didn't do that to some extent, we wouldn't have any friends at all, right? Because friends are people you do things for at the end of the day, right? You're there for them and you don't ask for a quid pro quo. Everyone has that friend that takes advantage, but they're still your friend. And you might resent the fact that they take advantage, but, you know, it'll be years before you ever sort of sit down and have a chat with them and say, look, hey, you're kind of a bad friend. And you'll have that talk with them about their friendship, and you'll ask them to change their ways before you're going to ask them to pay you back money for all the time that they've wasted or whatever have you, right? So what we're talking about then here is the difference in ethics between debt owed into a hierarchical context and debt owed in a horizontal context. And the difference is, one has ethical common decency, which is the common decency that there is between friends, and the other doesn't, right? So in many ways, we also, you know, treat strangers with this ethical decency. You know, think of how you wait in the line for a bus, for instance, and you don't jump to the top of the line when the bus arrives. You're patient, you wait your turn, and if there's no seats, then there's no seats. You don't throw a fit and go off like a gorilla on the people on the bus and start beating them up and throwing them off the bus, right? Now, that's what Graeber calls baseline communism, right? It's the baseline ethical decency that says we're all in a community together and we all have to help each other to get along. It's the baseline communism that helps you say to two children that are squabbling over their toys, you got to share your toys. So each of us can take from others according to our needs and give to others according to our abilities, and it's that motivation. Like it's what I can give, and what I can give I do give. I can wait in the line for a bus. I can tell the children to share their toys, and then when I'm in need, someone can help me, right? In a civilized society, that's how we should relate to each other. So the example then of how we treat friends, how we treat sometimes perfect strangers, like people lining up for a bus, shows us that debt can be rearranged. It is possible. What we owe each other can be negotiated. We do it all the time because, why? Because unlike banks, we believe in real morality. And the difference, the reason why we don't have that real morality in our society is because we are prevented from doing it by the violence of the state. The state enforces the will of the banks. The banks see our debts not in these human terms. They see our debts in these cold, stoical, monstrous terms, right? That the debt is a debt, and if you don't agree with me, I'll send the sheriff's office around and they will seize your goods. And they will, and so what that means is that the banks don't just have morality on their side, or the myth of morality of our debts, or whatever you want to call it. They have violence on their side, right? They have law enforcement on their side, and it's through that we can stand. If we don't pay our debts, we lose everything, right? So there's a huge amount of violence involved in the way debt exists in our society today. Right, so let's connect this to the Hunger Games. Well, Cindy Weber's analysis of the Hunger Games, I think, is excellent, frankly. And in the next couple of slides, I want to talk to you a little bit about it. The first thing is to sort of look at the place of debt in the Hunger Games story. The movie opens with us, we get to hear the voice of this person called Seneca Crane, who is the game maker of the annual Hunger Games in this future grim scientific science fictional world called Panem. And this person is being interviewed on the television by a guy called Caesar Flickerman, who's played by Stanley Tucci. And we see this interview is being broadcast all across this realm called Panem. It's basically a futuristic version of ancient Rome or something, right? It has a capital city, which is the center of the empire, and has 13 districts or colonies under the capital's control. Now, interestingly, the name of this realm, Panem, is derived from the Latin phrase panem et circenses, which means bread and circuses, of course, echoing back to the famous Roman bread and circuses games. And why would this futuristic empire be having bread and circuses? To distract the population from some kind of underlying economic issue, presumably. And we see in the so-called Treaty of Treason that this Empire of Panem has, that there is a way in which this bread and circuses is a very lived and real thing for the inhabitants of the realm, because every year, as we read here, in penance for their uprising, once upon a time, each district shall offer up a male and a female between the ages of 12 and 18 at a public reaping. These tributes shall be delivered to the custody of the capital, and then transferred to a public arena where they will fight to the death until a lone victor remains. Henceforth and forever, this pageant shall be known as the Hunger Games. Now, at the beginning of this film, then, we meet Katniss Everdeen, and she's got a friend by the name of Gale, and we know that they are sort of stealing away from their community, getting through the fence and going out hunting, although they're not supposed to be doing that. When nobody watched when no one's watching, they slip away. And in a moment where they take a break, Gale asks Katniss, why do we go through this ritual with the Hunger Games, right? Why do we bother with this? What if we all just turned off our televisions and no one watched the Hunger Games anymore? And Katniss laughs at this and says that Gale is delusional. For even though, of course, she herself is, in defiance, she's acting as they're even having the conversation in defiance of the capital's authority because she's crossed the fence. She understands that that's just her individual action and her individual violation of the rule. Like, to get everyone to do it would be kind of a remarkable feat, and not everyone is prepared to do it, clearly, because not everyone has the wherewithal or the understanding even to defy. And of course there's the fear of law enforcement being caught in defiance, so it tends to keep people under control. And so what's typical then in classical Cynthia Weber fashion, what's typical in the world of Panem is for the capital city to rule absolutely over its residents. And she, of course, is sort of an exception that proves the rule in that sense. So on the screen here, we learn a little bit about what maintains the rule of the capital, because it's not just as simple as like imperial domination, right? There's an authority culture, if you will, that the games reproduce, that the whole structure of the tribute system reproduces, right? And that is specifically a relationship of debt. Now, it's really important that we understand this, right? Because it's a debt and not a not an imperial kind of punishment. Because you could look at debt. There's another way of looking at debt as to say it's penance. Like if you are familiar with the Catholic Church, you go to the priest and you say your confession, and he gives you penance, and it cleanses your sins. That's not really what's going on here, because penance is personal or subjective, and that means it can be kind of dealt with personally and subjectively. Like, it can be cleansed. So that's not going to work for this colonial relationship, right? So this has to have the appearance of cold, dispassionate objectivity. And you see the parallel here, of course, with the way the banks, that our banks in our own world, deal with us when we owe them money, right? It's not personal, right? It's not about your human story. It's not tailored to you as an individual human. You're just a consumer. Your humanity has nothing to do with it. Your background, your context, your situation has nothing to do with it. You're human just the same as everyone else. So this sort of is kind of interesting then when President Snow, makes his speeches, and he reminds the audience of the history of Panem, where in the past the districts did try to question the authority of the capital. And the capital makes it very clear what the structure of the debtor-creditor relationship is now. The capital keeps the peace, and that's not free, right? So he says freedom has a cost. And what is the cost? The cost is the Hunger Games. The capital will keep the peace, but the only way you're going to have peace is through this process of the Hunger Games. So we can run that through David Graeber's analysis, and it actually is quite interesting. The Hunger Games, to quote Graeber, to kind of mess around with one of his quotes, turns morality into a matter of impersonal arithmetic, and by doing so justifies things that would otherwise seem outrageous and obscene. That's to say, the capital of Panem isn't dealing with the districts as human communities. It's dealing with them as debtors, right? People that owe you something, right? And that is another way of saying that the capital is relating to the districts with the phrase "a debt is a debt is a debt is a debt," right? It's nothing personal. It's just what you owe me, right? So why is that outrageous? Why is that obscene? Well, first of all, because in our financial crisis, we saw people getting turfed out of their homes. We saw people losing their cars, even though they needed their cars to get to work. So consequently, they would lose their job and maybe not even be able to take care of their parents anymore. Right? That was the obscene and outrageous stuff that was happening in our own context of austerity. But in the Hunger Games, you see that the games themselves are used as a way of justifying the use of the children in the districts as a kind of a form of currency, right? As a form of payment, a mechanism of payment for the debts that are owed to the capital. So that's children being reduced to a commodity of exchange, right? Exchange medium. And then the second point is, of course, that the children are then forced to fight to the death on live television in order to safeguard and preserve Panem's future. So just as these outrageous atrocities are enforced, these let's be clear now, let's use the right language, these dehumanizing practices that the banks have the license from the state to enforce on us, so too the capital of Panem has the right to enforce on its districts. So state violence is at the center of it all, and that's why anarchists have an insight on this, because that's what they're obsessed about, which is the violence of the state. None of this would be possible. Katniss Everdeen's predicaments would not be possible without the power of the state to enforce the economic reality that she's living in, where the district owes a debt of children to the capital. So clearly then, this world is a lot more like our world than it is to the ideal world of anarchism, wherein everyone would be friends and equals and might have debts with each other, but those debts would not be enforceable through a bank because there's human stories and you work those debts out with each other as friends, and everyone treats each other with common decency and friendship, like two children sharing their toys, right? It might sound ridiculous to you. I know it sounds ridiculous to some people, but I think it's one of those things where you start to think about it and you start to think, yeah, there's definitely a sense in which human beings, are nice to each other in an everyday sense, perfect strangers. We do wonderful things for perfect strangers, Question is how to formalize it, how to turn it into a political program, and that's, I think, what we're trying to get to with the question of Katniss Everdeen and the 99%. So let's talk about Katniss as a character. I mean, obviously her father died, according to the story, in a mine explosion, and she blames the capital for this. And ever since then, she's had to look after her depressed mother and her younger sister. And she is adept at hunting, so she uses her hunting skills, which were taught to her by her father, to provide a little bit extra food for her family, right? And she's quite an independent person, right? She doesn't really respect authority. And in that sense, I think she appears somewhat anarchistic, right? I mean, from David Graeber's perspective, she's definitely acting prefiguratively, right? She's acting, if Gandhi's in the room with us here and he says, be the change you want to see, well, Katniss Everdeen is being the change she wants to see, right? She's fiercely independent. She will violate the law to protect her family, to provide for her family, right? So she's definitely, if the phrase is from each according to their ability to each according to their needs, she's a great hunter. She's using her strength, her power, to do the things she needs to do to take care of those who she needs to take care of and who need her help. That's basic human decency, and she's not letting silly things like the arbitrary laws of the state get in the way of her doing that. She's fulfilling her personal obligation to the people she cares about, and so she practices on her own, right? And with her friends, horizontal communities as well. Like when she goes hunting with Gale, she's not the boss, right? They're working in cooperation with each other for mutual benefit. And it seems that in the community, people do help each other, even though they're not really supposed to. Like Peta, for example, helped her a long time ago by providing her and her family with bread. Again, just out of common decency. But Cynthia Weber raises a very good question, which is that it's not clear that Katniss is actually engaging in these anarchist practices for anarchist reasons, right? So her anarchist practices, what motivates them? Is it because she's a capital A anarchist or what, right? So remember that Graeber is saying this sort of everyday decency that anarchists or ordinary anarchists, lowercase anarchists, might relate to each other through. This ordinary decency is one thing, as he calls it, baseline communism. But to turn that baseline communism or that ordinary everyday communism or anarchism into a political program to get rid of the state, that's a whole other thing. So we have to be clear about this. What makes Katniss volunteer to go to the Hunger Games in the place of her sister is not some grand ideal or crusade or project to create capital A anarchism. She's not really herself political or interested in the struggle between liberty and totalitarianism. It's in fact just to save her sister from being picked. She feels obligation here to her sister, and also she recognizes that I think the capital has the power of the state behind it and will enforce its demand. So she caught between those two obligations, the enforced obligation on her of the state and the voluntary obligation she feels towards her sister. She kind of does what she has to do. So in that sense, then she's not ideological, right? So in that sense, no, she's not an anarchist. But let's think about how she understands debt. Arguably, there are ways in which her understanding of debt is very, very similar to the way Graeber understands debt. Debt is an obligation that is cold, stoically expressed, and the debt that the capital has imposed on the districts is something she hates, right? Because she knows it just like Graeber knows that it's impersonal. It's expressed almost numerically. It's numbers of children, right? And that's what's owed every year for the reaping. And so for her, then, this whole thing is corrupt, right? It's a stitch-up. And because she hates it so much, and because she hates being there, she's not going to play along, right? She doesn't want to be in any more debt at all. She doesn't want to be, one of the players on the arena who's seeking the support of the sponsors, for example, as those are just going to push her further into debt. And she prides herself in her independence, it seems. There's a quote in the novel, which doesn't make it into the movie, where she says about Peeta, and Peeta, of course, gave her bread when she was young, as I was saying before. Now, she believes that a gift is something you have to pay back no matter what. She says about Peeta's bread, I feel like I owe him something, and I hate owing people. But in fact, Peeta doesn't really want to be repaid for the bread, right? It wasn't a debt in that sense. It was Peeta's social obligation. Again, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. He had the bread, he could help, he helped her, and it was the right thing to do. She doesn't understand it that way. She doesn't understand what friendship is. So in this sense, then, the trilogy, the movie, the books, are this story about how Katniss is coming to grips with the fact that social obligations and calculable debts are not the same thing, right? Sometimes we're just doing things because we're socially obliged, and we want to be socially obliged, right? We're motivated by friendship. It's not the same thing as owing a bank a debt, right? So, this, I think, is where the movie analysis that Weber has to offer gets interesting, and I have to say, I do find it compelling. I wonder if I maybe disagree with it a little bit. I might share that with you now a little, but I think she's got a strong argument here. So how do we understand the suicide pact at the end? This is really where Weber's analysis kind of stands out. And what we have to remember here is that the capital, during the arena games is clearly changing the rules, right? It changes the rules, in fact, twice. First of all, it allows Peeta and Katniss to win as a couple, as a team. And then when they win as a team, then finally changes the rules again and says that they have to kill each other. So how do they avoid this, and what motivates them to make the stand that they make, which is, of course, that they decide to kill themselves? And I don't think I'm giving away anything here for those of you who haven't seen the movie. It's sort of a famous ending at this stage. But in this moment, arguably, there's a huge act of prefigurative politics, right? Because again, what is prefigurative politics? Go back to Gandhi. It's being the change that you want to see in the world. It's acting now as if you're free. And there's so many reasons to do that, because it's a powerful symbol to the world. Gandhi refused to obey authority, and he had thousands of followers flock to him for doing so. And together they all created an India that was independent already, even though the British were still the colonial power. There's no way the British had enough army or police forces to subjugate thousands and thousands of people who were acting as if they were free, acting as if they were free of Britain. Gandhi famously marched thousands and thousands of Indian people to the ocean to mine salt, because they didn't want to pay the tax on salt to the British Empire. And in that moment, really, the authority, the legitimacy of the British colonial government completely dissolved. And that happened, we have to understand, that happened through this idea of being the change that you want to see in the world. One person doing it might not be that powerful, but if another person sees, it becomes something, right? And then 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, suddenly you've got Occupy Wall Street. Suddenly you have Tahrir Square in Egypt in 2011. Suddenly you have Gezi Park in Turkey, in Istanbul, Turkey in 2013. Massive acts of civil resistance. How did the Berlin Wall fall? Right? It was one person showed up, another person, suddenly you've got a critical mass, and thousands of people are coming down to the Berlin Wall and demanding that the wall be taken down. And the police blinked, right? They're like, well, we're not going to shoot all of these people, right? We'd shoot maybe one of them, 2 of them. We're not going to shoot hundreds of thousands of people. And the police power suddenly is no power at all, right? So this is how prefigurative politics works, and this is how Katniss becomes a huge threat, even as she wins the Hunger Games. The Capitol realizes that should she end up killing herself, it would be a massive public humiliation and delegitimization of their power, because she's going to be free. Even in her death, she's going to have an act of freedom in defiance of the power of the state. So she reveals then as personal. This is huge, right? I think she's showing that she disregards the debt that she owes to the state, right? That the state says she owes it. She says, no, I am free, right? And that debt, that, by the way, that you said was not personal, it is personal. I'm a human being, and I have a story, and the story that I have to tell shows everyone why the debt that you're saying that I owe is actually barbaric, right? Actually an atrocity. You're imposing it on me. You're saying it's impersonal. Actually, no, I am not an impersonal thing to be demanded debt of. I'm not just a consumer. I'm a fully fledged human being, and there's a story behind the debt that I owe you. And when you look closely at the details of that story, it becomes questionable whether the edicts of common human decency should require me to pay this debt. So that's at the kernel of anarchism. This is a very anarchist story in that sense, right? Because at the end, she reveals her humanity to the world, and in doing so, she's not an impersonal consumer. She's a fully fledged human being demanding decency, and in this she becomes a symbol of liberty for the districts, a symbol of defiance against the creditor-debtor relationship that was demanded of her, and not just of her, but of everyone who lives in Panem, and that creditor-debtor relationship that structures the entire relationship of all the citizens of Panem since the end of the rebellion. So it's a very strong way to end the analysis, and I think Cynthia Weber's very right there. But if you read the conclusion of Weber's chapter, she asks a very interesting question, which is that maybe we go back and think a little bit about Katniss, who's clearly anti-authoritarian, and in that sense does seem to be kind of anarchistic. But remember, earlier on in the lecture, we talked about the Tea Party, we talked about anarchism also having kind of a cousin called libertarianism, and that anarchism actually is kind of a subset of libertarianism, but libertarianism wants to keep the state and anarchism wants to get rid of it, right? So community-oriented anarchists, true anarchists, right, they are going to be striving for the common good and doing it in a way that has a view that the state is the ultimate obstacle to the full empowerment of the community, and the state has to be gotten rid of. Individualist anarchists are not protesting against the state. They're not protesting to get rid of the state. They're protesting to the state. They're appealing to the state for some kind of favor, for some kind of personal self-benefit. And so for Katniss, what's her agenda here? And I think it's not clear at the end of the day. We get to see in the subsequent movies, because it's a trilogy, of course, Or I guess there's 4 movies actually, because the last one they broke up into 2, didn't they? But I think you get to see she has very ambiguous feelings about anarchism. She's got very ambiguous feelings about struggling against the state. I think she's definitely more motivated by a desire to take care of hers. And this is what motivates Cynthia Weber to say in the conclusion of her great chapter, and I quote, "Just because a person battles for their private liberties in public does not mean that they are battling for the public or are constituting a new public like the 99%. It's a powerful way to end. And it does, for me, raise the question of why perhaps Hart and Negri might be useful here, because they recognize that in order to achieve democracy, we have to find a struggle in common. It's not clear to me that David Graeber ever really articulates a common that anarchism can get behind. It seems anarchism is sovereign individuals who have come together for the purposes of horizontal governance to govern themselves. It's not clear what they actually are. I mean, just because they are anarchists doesn't mean that they have values, right? So this is, I think, perhaps where the obsession with horizontalism starts to maybe be revealed as a little bit shallow, because horizontalism has an idea that the goal is democracy, as opposed to democracy itself being a tool for something else, right? And I think that, when you look at Hart and Negri's Multitude, it seems that maybe they do have a sense that democracy is for something else, that it's a means of our transformation into something called a multitude. We're not just going to be the 99%, we're going to be something that can have an identity for itself. So I'll leave you on that thought. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. It's a fascinating topic, great film, and I just want to thank you for being part of the class this semester. It's been really fun having you, working with you through these lectures, and I hope we will see you in another class at some time in the future. Thank you. Bye-bye.